Hi everybody, my name is Francesco Orsi. I'm an associate professor in theoretical ethics at the University of Tartu, Estonia. And today I wanted to talk to you about my book that was recently published by Routledge, The Guise of the Good, A Philosophical History. So thanks for joining me. So in this book, I tackle for the first time the whole history of one of the big philosophical claims that pretty much any Western philosopher discussed, sometimes approved of, sometimes criticized. And to see the importance of this idea that I call, that is known as the Guise of the Good, we could look at, for example, even Dante's Commedia, where Virgil at some point explains for Dante that everyone confusedly apprehends and desires a good in which the soul may rest. And because of that, everyone strives to be joined to it, be joined to the good, right? Flash forward a few hundred years, we get Joseph Raz, who, in a pretty famous paper, claims that from its earliest origins, whatever version of the Guise of the Good was viewed with favor was the keystone keeping in place and bridging the theory of value, the theory of normativity and rationality, and the understanding of intentional action. Okay. So what I want to do with this book was to essentially make good on Raz's claim that from its earliest origins, this idea was indeed a central piece of philosophy for, and in particular, was a bridge between different areas of philosophy, theory of value, theory of reasons, and philosophy of action, broadly understood. So my hope is that this book will be of interest both to historians, but also to people working in the contemporary debate around these areas. One thing that I should say right from the start is how I understood this idea of the Guise of the Good in the book, right? And I settled on a formulation that I think is good enough, at least for the purpose of the book. A first formulation is what I call here GG, that if you desire something, then that thing, what you desire, appears to you under the guise of the good. It seems good to you in some respect or other. So if you desire to eat an apple, for example, then the apple, or perhaps eating the apple, appears to you under the guise of the good. Perhaps it appears to you as something tasty to eat, right? Or maybe it appears to you as what the doctor advised you to eat, okay? Now, this formulation is good enough and captures some of the historical formulations, such as Aquinas, for example, that I put up on this slide. But in the tradition, this thesis, GG, was usually understood implicitly to contain a certain kind of direction of explanation between desiring something and the thing appearing to the agent under the guise of the good. So I think a better formulation is what I put on this slide as GG+. So if you desire something, then you desire it because it appears to you under the guise of the good. And Immanuel Kant was the one philosopher, perhaps, who more than others stressed that it makes a huge difference whether you think that there's just a correlation, basically, between desiring something and the object appearing to you under the guise of the good, or whether you think that there's a priority. So things appear to you, and that's what explains why, at least partly, why you desire them, okay? So in the case, an example that I just gave you, right, you want to eat the apple in part because eating the apple appears good to you, or the apple appears to you to have some desirable qualities, right? Just to put it like that. Now, a little bit about the background to my project. I've been working on the Guise of the Good for a few years, mostly in from a theoretical point of view, but lately also from an historical point of view. So I worked a little bit on Hume, and a little bit on John Stuart Mill, and the Mill's paper was included in a special issue that I edited specifically on the early modern period of the history of the guys of the good, where I got some some brilliant scholars running papers on various early modern philosophers. Why did I decide to write this book? Well, the first thing I want to say is that when I was writing this book, I was literally standing on the shoulders of giants. And by giants, I don't mean only the famous philosophers that I talk about in the book, but all the fine scholarship and literature that I've used in trying to better understand what the great philosophers were trying to say, what kind of arguments they were or they were not bringing out in favor of or against the guys of the good, right? So there was a lot of scholarship already existing, although sometimes not under the label the guys of the good. But a book like this one just didn't exist. So I thought it would be worth writing a comprehensive narration right from Socrates, basically, about how Western philosophers had understood and argued for, but also criticized this idea of the guys of the good. And recently there's been a lot of revival of this idea, first with a few like landmark articles like Stoker's and Velleman's and Stampis, but in the last roughly 20-25 years, there's been systematic attention devoted to the guys of the good. And there's been what philosophers call like a little cottage industry producing a lot of work on the guys of the good, for and against. Then the reason was that I thought that by better understanding the past and going deeper into the past of this philosophical idea, the future could be illuminated, contemporary debates could be brought forward, moved forward, right? Although in the book I mostly stick to an historical treatment, so I don't advance any particular claim about how the contemporary debate might move forward. And last but not least, I very much hope that my book will inspire smaller scale, perhaps better focused in some cases, and also comparative research on the guys of the good, taking into account what non-Western philosophical traditions have to say about this topic, because I'm sure there's nothing particularly Western about this idea of the guys of the good. But I would leave it to other specialists to offer such a comprehensive and inclusive work. So a little bit about the table of contents, so you can see what I'm covering and what I'm not covering in the book, right? So there's a first chapter where I introduce the guys of the good and make several distinctions, and also explain my basically methodology that I'm coming back to in a second. And then I start a fairly chronological narration, starting from Socrates and Plato, moving on to Aristotle and a little bit about the Stoics too. Then I have two chapters on basically medieval philosophy, scholastic philosophy. One chapter covering Augustine and Aquinas, and the other chapter covering Duns Scotus and William Ockham, who were some among the first, I would say, doubters of the guys of the good. And then ending the chapter with Francisco Suarez, a sort of late Spanish scholastic who reaffirmed the guys of the good in slightly different philosophical but also religious context at the end of the 16th century. Then I move on to the early modern period, where things start to shake a little bit, first with Descartes, then with Spinoza, and in the next chapter with Hobbes. Spinoza and Hobbes are perhaps the two most explicit critics, so not just doubters, but actually critics of the guys of the good in the early modern period. I talk about Locke as well in chapter 7, and then I have a chapter 8 about Hume and Kant, and where I try to argue that Hume, despite appearances and despite a certain amount of scholarship, actually could be seen as advocating a certain kind of gas of the good thesis. And also analyze Kant's sort of troubled stance towards the gas of the good. Then I move on to chapter 9 to the 19th century, where I cover some authors whose relationship to the gas of the good is not actually usually has not been particularly studied, such as Hegel, John Stuart Mill, and Nietzsche. Nietzsche being they call him one of the contemporary critics of the guys of the good, again in a very different philosophical context than Hobbes or Spinoza. And then Franz Brentano, who very much liked this idea of the guys of the good and brought forward a new and original interpretation of it, which deserves a lot of attention, I think. And then I end with a chapter on Elizabeth Anscombe, who should be credited for bringing back the gas of the good into the contemporary philosophical debate. So basically, there's no article written nowadays that makes no reference to Elizabeth Anscombe, who talks about the gas of the good, and she defends it in her Intention. That was 1957. And that's where the book stops. So the book stops before the contemporary debate. The last thing I wanted to talk about is how I proceeded in interrogating the texts. What kind of questions I've been asking the texts, and what kind of answers I was hoping to get from the text, trying to understand where a certain philosopher stands regarding the gas of the good. So in the introduction, I lay out 7 questions that I have more or less followed in writing the text, and in also reading both primary sources and scholarship. So the first question was quite simply, what claims does an author make which seem to be worded like the gas of the good, or as worded like its negation, right? Or when claims are not so explicit, then what claims does the author make that somehow commit them in favor of or against the gas of the good? Sometimes things are left quite implicit. Then terminological questions, such as what the author means by these key terms like desire, or will, or good, or the good, and so on. Then what is the status of the claims which are being made? Purely conceptual claim, like it's in the concept of desiring, that we only desire what appears good to us, or maybe it's just just an empirical claim about human beings or average human beings, right? And then the question about arguments. Does the author somehow support the gas of the good with an argument? Does the author somehow criticize the gas of the good with an argument? This is an important issue because for a very long part of its history, it seemed like the gas of the good was taken as a self-evident axiom, not in need of any support or any argument. Although already with somebody like Thomas Aquinas, we start seeing actual arguments being offered. How good those arguments are, that's for the book. I must say I had a lot of fun trying to reconstruct arguments for and against, especially during the Middle Age period that contains a lot of interesting stuff that, of course, I wasn't able to include in the book as well. And then the implications of the gas of the good. Those are questions 6 and 7 here. The implications regarding, for example, free will, the existence of free will, or the nature of free will. Implications regarding whether we're able to want something without seeing anything good about it, right? And so on. And then the broader implications. In many chapters, I talk a little bit about how the gas of the good sort of intersects with other parts of an author's philosophy, ethics, perhaps most obviously moral philosophy, but sometimes also political philosophy, and sometimes also metaphysics or general philosophy of mind as well, right? So these are the questions that I've been working on in writing the book. So I hope I've given you enough content to interest you in the book, and thanks for watching.